When the USS Mayflower docked in New York Harbor in April 1654, the 23 Jews aboard had no idea they were stepping into a colony that did not want them. Peter Stuyvesant, Director General of New Amsterdam, immediately petitioned the Dutch West India Company to expel them, calling them members of a deceitful race who would infect his Christian settlement. How did this handful of refugees, penniless and stateless, manage not only to stay but to lay the groundwork for principles that would define American religious freedom itself? The refugees were Sephardic Jews fleeing the Portuguese reconquest of Dutch Brazil, where the Inquisition had resumed its work. They arrived with almost nothing, and Stuyvesant saw them as economic parasites. But the company in Amsterdam overruled him, citing the investments and service Jewish shareholders had already provided to the colony. More importantly, they invoked a principle that would echo through centuries. These Jews had fought for the Dutch and earned the right to live and trade under Dutch protection. The company ordered Stuyvesant to let them stay, provided they support their own poor and worship in private. It was a grudging tolerance, not freedom, but it was a foothold. And from that foothold, these 23 people began something irreversible. One of them was Asa Levy, a butcher by trade, who refused to accept second-class status. In 1655, when Jews were denied the right to stand guard duty and instead forced to pay a tax, Levy petitioned for the same military obligations as Christians. The colony resisted. Levy persisted. By 1657, he won, becoming the first Jew in North America to serve in a civic militia. That same year, he was granted a license to trade anywhere in the colony, and by 1661, he owned real estate in Manhattan. Levy didn't just survive in the New World. He forced it to expand its definition of who belonged. His victories were small in scope, but seismic in precedent. They established that Jewish residents could claim legal equality, not as a gift, but as a right earned through contribution and persistence. If you're starting to see how these tiny fractures in colonial exclusion became the architecture of American pluralism, you're uncovering exactly the kind of hidden turning points we dig into on this channel. Hit subscribe now, because the stories that shape nations are almost never the ones taught in school, and we're here to surface the ones that actually move the needle. Fast forward to the Revolutionary War, and Jewish participation was wildly disproportionate to their numbers. Haim Salomon, a Polish-born Jew living in New York, was arrested by the British in 1776 for espionage. He had been working as a financial broker, but also as a secret agent for the Continental Army, helping American and French prisoners escape. The British released him, thinking he could be useful as an interpreter for Hessian mercenaries. Instead, Salomon used his position to encourage desertions. When the British discovered this, he fled to Philadelphia, barely escaping execution. In Philadelphia, Salomon became the broker between the American government and French financiers. The Continental Congress was broke. Soldiers were deserting. The war was being lost, not on battlefields, but in ledgers. Salomon raised hundreds of thousands of dollars, brokering bills of exchange, negotiating loans, and personally advancing credit to members of Congress, including James Madison. Most of that money was never repaid. When Salomon died in 1785, he was bankrupt. His family spent decades trying to recover what was owed. The government never settled the debt, but without Salomon's financial networks, the revolutionary cause might have collapsed before Yorktown. This pattern repeats. Jewish contributions that hold up entire structures but remain mostly invisible until someone traces the ledger backward. In the 19th century, Jewish immigrants began arriving in larger waves, first from German-speaking lands, then from Eastern Europe. They entered an economy roaring with industrialization and cities swelling beyond the capacity of their infrastructure. The question of what happens when old European hierarchies dissolve and merit, or the appearance of it, begins to matter more than birthright, was being tested in real time. Jews had centuries of experience operating in economies where they were excluded from guilds and landowning but tolerated in commerce and finance. In America, those same skills became engines of upward mobility. But it was not just business, it was institution building. Consider the garment industry. By the early 20th century, Eastern European Jews dominated it, not as sweatshop owners alone, but as workers, union organizers, and eventually reformers who reshaped American labor law. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911 killed 146 garment workers, most of them young Jewish and Italian women. The doors had been locked to prevent theft. The fire escapes were incomplete. The owners were acquitted. The public rage that followed was immense. Jewish labor leaders like Rose Schneiderman herself, a former cap maker, channeled that rage into the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, which became one of the most powerful labor organizations in the country. Schneiderman's speech after the fire is still studied today. She said, "The life of men and women is so cheap and property is so sacred that it would take the burning of more workers to force change." She was right, but she did not wait. She lobbied for fire safety codes, maximum hour laws, and minimum wage protections that became models nationwide. The New Deal labor framework owes a direct lineage to Jewish garment workers who refused to accept that industrialization required human sacrifice. But the influence was not only economic, it was intellectual and cultural, and this is where the stakes widened dramatically. In the early 20th century, American universities were not neutral arenas of merit. They were gatekeepers of a Protestant elite, and Jewish students were beginning to crack those gates in numbers that alarmed administrators. By the 1920s, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton had implemented quotas limiting Jewish enrollment. The rationale was openly discussed. Too many Jews would alter the character of the institution. The quotas were not hidden. They were policy. Jewish students responded by excelling anyway, often in fields that could not easily exclude them, particularly the sciences, law, and the emerging social sciences. This was not simply perseverance. It was strategic adaptation under constraint, and it produced a disproportionate output of intellectual capital that would later define American research universities. Albert Einstein's arrival in America in 1933, fleeing Nazi Germany, symbolizes this turning point. He was already the most famous scientist alive. Princeton offered him a position at the newly formed Institute for Advanced Study, and he accepted, never returning to Europe. But Einstein was not alone. Thousands of Jewish scientists, writers, and artists fled Europe in the 1930s and early 1940s, and America absorbed them not out of pure altruism, but because it recognized the strategic value of their talent. The Manhattan Project, which developed the atomic bomb, was led by J. Robert Oppenheimer, a Jewish theoretical physicist, and included a staggering number of Jewish émigrés. Enrico Fermi, though not Jewish, had fled Italy with his Jewish wife. Edward Teller, Leo Szilard, Niels Bohr, all of them either Jewish or married into Jewish families, all of them refugees, all of them indispensable. The bomb that ended the war and ushered in the nuclear age was, in large part, built by Jews who had been expelled from European institutions that once led the world in physics. This brings us to the question of political emancipation and how Jewish immigrants redefined citizenship itself. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, American Jewish communities became testing grounds for progressive politics. The settlement house movement, pioneered by figures like Lillian Wald, a Jewish nurse who founded the Henry Street settlement in New York, brought healthcare, education, and legal aid directly into immigrant neighborhoods. Wald's public health nurses became the template for visiting nurse services nationwide. She lobbied for child labor laws and helped establish the Children's Bureau, the first federal agency dedicated to child welfare. Her work was grounded in Jewish ethics of social responsibility, but it was enacted in secular universalist terms. This was a pattern. Jewish activists translated religious imperatives into civic reform that benefited everyone. The same dynamic played out in the civil rights movement when three young men, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, were murdered in Mississippi in 1964 for registering black voters. Two of them were Jewish. Goodman and Schwerner were not outliers. Jewish organizations like the American Jewish Congress and the Anti-Defamation League were early and consistent allies in the fight for desegregation. Jewish lawyers argued landmark cases before the Supreme Court. Jack Greenberg, who succeeded Thurgood Marshall as head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, was Jewish. The alliance was not without tension, particularly as Black Power movements later critiqued white involvement in their liberation struggles. But in the critical decade of the 1950s and 1960s, Jewish participation in civil rights was both morally driven and self-interested. Jews understood that a society based on racial or religious hierarchy would never be safe for them either. Their history taught them that tolerance is indivisible. Then there is the transformation of American media and entertainment, an industry so saturated with Jewish founders that it reshaped global culture. The major Hollywood studios, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, Warner Brothers, Paramount, Universal, 20th Century Fox, were all founded by Jewish immigrants or their children. Men like Louis B. Mayer, the Warner Brothers, Adolf Zukor, Carl Laemmle, and William Fox arrived from Eastern Europe with almost nothing and built an empire that exported the American dream worldwide. But they did so by erasing much of their own Jewishness on screen. They created a sanitized, idealized America where ethnic difference was smoothed into assimilation, where Christmas was universal and Easter was pastel. This was survival strategy as much as creative vision. They knew their audience was largely Christian, and they knew that being too visibly Jewish could invite backlash. So they hid in plain sight, shaping what America thought it was while rarely showing themselves. Yet their influence was profound. The movies taught Americans how to speak, dress, fall in love, and imagine heroism. The production code, ironically, was shaped heavily by Jewish studio executives trying to preempt censorship by proving their moral responsibility. The irony runs deep. Jewish moguls collaborated in creating moral guidelines rooted in Christian conservatism to protect an industry they built. This tension between assimilation and identity, between visibility and safety, runs through the entire Jewish American experience. Television followed the same arc. The early networks, CBS, NBC, and ABC, had significant Jewish leadership. William Paley built CBS into a cultural powerhouse. David Sarnoff led RCA and NBC. They programmed for Middle America, but they also green-lighted shows that gently pushed boundaries, that introduced suburban audiences to ideas about tolerance, pluralism, and social justice wrapped in sitcoms and dramas. Norman Lear, a Jewish producer, created All in the Family, which forced living rooms across America to confront bigotry by making it the subject of uncomfortable comedy. Lear's shows were not Jewish in content, but they were Jewish in ethos, argumentative, questioning, morally urgent. He used television not to reflect America as it was, but to nudge it toward what it might become. In science and medicine, Jewish Americans continued the trajectory begun by Einstein's generation. Jonas Salk, son of Russian Jewish immigrants, developed the polio vaccine in 1955 and refused to patent it, forgoing enormous wealth so that it could be distributed widely. When asked who owned the patent, Salk famously replied, "The people I would say, there is no patent. Could you patent the sun?" His decision saved millions of lives and reflected a particular vision of knowledge as collective inheritance rather than private property. That vision was not universal among scientists, but it was common among Jewish researchers who saw their work as repayment for refuge and opportunity. The legal profession saw similar patterns. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the daughter of Jewish immigrants, faced discrimination both as a woman and as a Jew when she entered law school in the 1950s. Firms would not hire her. She turned to academia and eventually to appellate litigation, where she systematically dismantled legal sex discrimination in a series of cases in the 1970s. As a Supreme Court justice, she became an icon, but her methodology was deeply rooted in Jewish textual analysis, the Talmudic practice of reading closely, arguing from principle, and building precedent incrementally. She did not invoke Judaism in her opinions, but her intellectual habits were shaped by it. The same can be said of Justices Louis Brandeis, Benjamin Cardozo, Felix Frankfurter, Stephen Breyer, and Elena Kagan. The American legal system in its modern form has been profoundly influenced by Jewish jurists who brought rigorous interpretive traditions into constitutional law. The question of Israel and American foreign policy introduces a more contentious dimension after the Holocaust. American Jewish communities mobilized politically in ways they had not before. The establishment of Israel in 1948 became a focal point of identity and activism. Jewish Americans lobbied for U.S. recognition, which President Truman granted within hours of Israel's declaration of independence. That decision was controversial within Truman's administration. The State Department opposed it, fearing it would alienate Arab oil producers and Soviet influence. Truman overruled them, influenced in part by Jewish advisors and donors, but also by his own reading of history and morality. The U.S.-Israel relationship that followed became one of the most durable and controversial alliances in American foreign policy, shaping Middle East strategy for decades and creating political fault lines that persist today. Domestically, the Jewish experience of systemic exclusion and persecution fueled a commitment to civil liberties that extended far beyond Jewish concerns. The American Civil Liberties Union, founded in 1920, had significant Jewish leadership and membership. Jewish lawyers defended free speech for communists, anarchists, and white supremacists, applying the principle that rights must be universal or they are meaningless. This was not popular. During the Red Scare and McCarthyism, Jewish leftists were disproportionately targeted, suspected of dual loyalty or subversion. The Rosenberg trial, in which Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed for espionage in 1953, became a flashpoint. They were guilty of passing secrets, but the severity of their punishment and the rhetoric around it carried unmistakable anti-Semitic undertones. Their execution haunted Jewish communities for decades, a reminder that even in America, belonging was conditional. What binds these threads together is a recurring strategy. Jews shaped American history not by seeking to dominate, but by building systems, institutions, and norms that protected pluralism, merit, and debate. They did so because exclusion had taught them that rigid hierarchies are lethal, that societies that tolerate difference are safer for everyone, and that law, science, culture, and commerce are arenas where argument and innovation can substitute for inherited power. This was pragmatic as much as principled. In every case, Jewish Americans advanced their interests by advancing universal frameworks. They fought for labor rights because workers were exploited. They fought for civil rights because racism was unjust. They built studios and networks because entertainment was open to outsiders. They excelled in science and law because those fields rewarded talent over pedigree, at least more than others did. The legacy is not without contradictions. Jewish success in America fed accusations of clannishness and control, the ancient conspiracy theories repackaged for a modern age. The visibility of Jewish names in finance, media, and politics made them targets during economic downturns and cultural backlash. The same achievements that proved integration was possible were also cited as evidence of undue influence. This paradox is unresolved. Even today, American Jews are simultaneously seen as white and as other, as insiders and outsiders, as beneficiaries of privilege, and as perennial targets of hate crimes. What remains undeniable is that American history cannot be told honestly without accounting for Jewish contributions to its legal philosophy, labor movements, scientific infrastructure, entertainment industry, civil rights struggles, and intellectual culture. These were not incidental, they were structural. When Asa Levy demanded the right to stand guard, he set a precedent for citizenship as reciprocal obligation. When Haim Salomon financed a revolution, he tied Jewish fate to American independence. When garment workers organized after Triangle, they established that economic justice was inseparable from dignity. When Einstein fled to Princeton, he carried the future of physics with him. When Salk gave away the polio vaccine, he demonstrated that innovation could serve humanity without privatization. When Ginsburg argued for equality, she encoded Jewish interpretive rigor into constitutional law. Each decision, each act, rippled outward. The American experiment promised that people could remake themselves, that origin did not have to be destiny, and that difference could coexist with belonging. Jews tested that promise relentlessly, and in doing so, they forced the country to live up to it more fully than it might have otherwise. Their history in America is not a story of passive assimilation, but of active negotiation, of leveraging marginality into influence, and of insisting that universal principles apply universally. The question we are left with is whether that framework, built over centuries of struggle and adaptation, can endure the pressures of polarization, nationalism, and resurgent tribalism. The answer will determine not only the future of Jewish life in America, but the durability of pluralism itself.